Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford. So you probably already know what the University of Oxford is, but I'll just pause for a moment to tell you a little bit about the Blavatnik School of Government and the Alfred Landecker Foundation, which are hosting this event today. So the Blavatnik School of Government is an interdisciplinary school focusing on public policy. We engage with policymakers around the world on questions of better governance and better services. And we have a particular specialism in the economics and politics of the Global South, with many of our researchers working on development in India, Africa, and Latin America. But we also work on many of the pressing problems of the day. So we have programs on climate change, on the ethics and law of war, and cybersecurity, among many others. The Alfred Landecker Foundation, who funds my chair, is a German foundation. They're named after a victim of the Holocaust, Alfred Landecker. And the foundation is partially devoted to Holocaust memorialization, but fights group-based hatred of all sorts, and also has many programs protecting democracy, particularly against right-wing threats and other forms of extremism and misuses of social media and so on. At the Blavatnik School, we have the Alfred Landecker Programme, which is hosting us today. And here our focus is on minority rights and strengthening democracy. And as a result, you can see what a close link today's session on ethnicity is, and we are delighted to be hosting or co-hosting this event, launching the new volume in Ethnic and Racial Studies, What's Ethnicity Got to Do with It? And on that note, let me hand over to Marietta, who is one of the postdocs on the Alfred Landecker Programme, or just finishing her session, and one of the editors and authors in that volume. So Marietta, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe, for this kind introduction. I'm also joined today by Lior Iras, who is the other Alfred Landecker postdoctoral research fellow, and we will be chairing the session throughout. I'll give the word briefly to Lior, and then we'll provide you with a short summary of the volume on ethnicity before we launch into the discussion. Lior, over to you.
Thank you, Marietta. So, as Marietta said, my name is Lior Erez. I'm the Alfred Landecker postdoctoral fellow here at the Blavatnik School. The way we're going to run the discussion today is that first I'm going to give Marietta the floor for a couple of minutes as the co-editor of the special issue to introduce the main themes and questions leading this discussion of this important volume. And then we're going to go between the different contributors, asking a few questions on the main ideas and concepts arising from the contributions. At the end, we'll have some time for questions from the audience, and then we'll conclude. So with that, I'm going to pass to Marietta to introduce the special issue. Marietta also has a contribution in the issue entitled Ethnic Identity as a Challenge to Anti-Discrimination Law. So Marietta, take it away, a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on.
Thank you again, Lior. And again, a warm welcome to everyone joining us online. It's an honor to share the publication of this special issue on ethnicity titled What's Ethnicity Got to Do with It? Religious and Racial Politics in Europe. This issue was published very recently, which I co-edited with Elizabeth Becker, who is a sociologist based at the University of Heidelberg. And between the disciplines of politics and sociology, we have been asking this question: how can we make more sense of ethnicity as a category of belonging, as a category of self-understanding, and as a category for policy making and the law? And we often found that actually the ways in which we talk about ethnicity in Europe are tied to conversations about religion. We've also found that a lot of these conversations are tied to race. And there is a sort of entrenchment, as it were, of ethnicity in religion and in race. And what we've been trying to do is to develop a different kind of language to talk about this deep interconnection, really, of ethnicity, religion, and race as different categories that partially overlap, but also have an integrity of their own. The language of ethnicity also helps us to contextualize some of the conversations about diversity and minoritization in Europe, with specific reference to groups that have historically been at receiving end of governmental othering or state-sanctioned othering. And in this regard, we, of course, talk about Jewish communities, but we also talk about Muslim communities and about Roma communities, traveler communities. And the point of this is that actually there is a lot of overlap in the kinds of othering that we see, even if socially there seems to be such an entrenchment between left and right of the minorities that one is more or less sympathetic to. So the goal of this special issue is really to find a language that bridges those concerns. The other thing that the special issue is trying to bridge is a distance between, on the one hand, self-identification and those categories for policy making and the law. Very often when people talk about particular practices that might be cultural or perhaps certain choices for dress or for cuisine come with assumptions that this must be particularly religious or not, for example. And the issue really is that people can adhere to certain practices for all sorts of reasons, and it might be partially religious and it might be partially cultural. Much like we've talked about sort of cultural Christianity or the secular Jew, there is many ways of being Muslim, and there's many ways of being a Jew, there's many ways of being a lot of different things. So we're really trying to find ways of talking about the self-identification that doesn't force people to say, I've been discriminated on the basis of religion or of race, if in fact they don't identify with that particular form of identity. But also on the other side, from the side of the government, it's not enough to talk about religion and race. It's very limiting to talk about religion and race. And actually, it could open up a different kind of conversation about what inclusion means, but also what discrimination looks like if we are to take ethnicity much more seriously. I think what is important to highlight here is that there are several contributions in this issue that talk to different dimensions of ethnicity. In the introduction, Elizabeth and I will talk about sort of ethnicity from the perspective of the knot of distinction. Initially, sort of the language that came out of sociology and Stuart Hall as a way of saying actually a lot of differences are very intertwined and can't really just pick up one strand of it and say this is what we're talking about. There's always a complexity that and a further layering to it that maybe the language that we use doesn't really accommodate. But then there are several sort of conversations within the issue. So one of these conversations is really between Sophie Lauwers and Timo Koch. We will talk about the relationship between the understandings of nation and nationhood, and specifically the idea of fictive ethnicization, as we will hear more from Sophie later in the session. We will get more of a flavor of what that might be about. But it is all about majorities and minorities shaping up, not so much in practice or in a sort of empirical sense, but in a sort of imaginary sense, and how people understand themselves within a political community. Now, Timo Koch will talk about the importance of ethnicity in far-right spaces, and will explain how there is different bridge frames, as it were, that mean that when you talk about a particular issue, you might mobilize very different constituencies. So to make that really concrete, when, for example, people talk about ethnicity in the far right, it might be about a certain idea of ethnic purity, even, as we sometimes find in far right circles. But the reason that that people might exclude ethnic minorities might be very different. So some people might simply dislike foreigners, but other people might be really invested in, say, the pro-natalist movement and in the preservation of a certain ethnicity, and even go as far as calling for specific privileges for the majority ethnicity in a particular society. There's also a discussion, mostly by Tina Magazzini and Gülay Türkmen and Elizabeth Becker, about how we talk about categories of belonging, both sociologically and legally. So Tina has put a lot of work into mapping how different countries use categories of religion, race, and ethnicity in a way to highlight really the sort of differences in the legal understanding of belonging across European states. There is another conversation here between Gülay Türkmen and Elizabeth Becker about what it means to then come to a more sort of granular understanding of ethnicity, whereby Gülay Türkmen will say several things. The important thing is here to sort of come to terms with classification struggles, as it were. Like, you need to name something, but it doesn't always map up nicely or neatly onto reality. And she says, actually, when we've talked about religion, ethnicity, and race, we still need to talk about class as well, as we find that particularly in migrant communities, there can be huge class differences that also impact on the belonging of different newcomers, as it were. Now, Elizabeth Becker develops the idea of new ethnicities, and as a way of talking about this knot of distinction, ethnicity, race, and religion, from the perspective of diasporic communities. And what she does very nicely is to bridge conversations about how this idea of this interconnection of identity is present both in the Jewish diasporic community as well as in Muslim diasporic communities. And she finds that new ethnicities can be a really good way of bridging the experiences of these kinds of minorities. Then there are several conversations towards the end of the special issue about the legal classification of ethnicity. I will say a little bit about this myself further along in the session when we come back to the issue of the law. But in short, this comes back to the importance of actually protecting ethnicity explicitly in the law, but also for finding strategies of bridging sort of race and religion when ethnicity actually isn't part of the law and it's still sort of a vacuum that needs to be grappled with. Now, actually, Chris van der Pas wrote about the Netherlands in particular, about ethnic profiling, and conclude that often individual claims to discrimination can come up to very meaningful barriers of individuals who struggle to find their way to courts, but also the issue of sort of on a more philosophical level, like, is it enough to treat ethnic disadvantages on an individual or case-to-case basis, or do we need to think of this from a more structural or institutional perspective? And they suggest that, for example, public sector duties, which are used in the UK, could be one strategy for talking about ethnic discrimination in the Netherlands. They also talk about strategic litigation and the possibility of different cases being joined up as it were a kind of class action issue. Now, the special issue is completed then by Vera Messing and András Pab. We will talk specifically about the position of the Roma community in Hungary, and we'll highlight several things that come up in the special issue. On the one hand, the sort of privilegization, the privilege of a particular ethnicity within Hungary and the disadvantage that comes with that for other minorities, but also the historic minoritization of Roma communities in Hungary. And they show very nicely how this really is salient in the public sector, but also in just things as simple as, can I find a job with the right kind of background, or with a certain kind of background. And I will conclude that actually it is really what maybe one of the significant issues here is the fragmentation of policies around ethnicity that really prevents sort of structural approach to ethnic inclusion. So again, this was a special issue in Ethnic and Racial Studies. It is online. Several of the papers are open access. And as I come to a close of this presentation, I would really like to thank Jonathan Wolf and the Alfred Landecker Programme at the Blavatnik School of Government for supporting this, as well as the University of Heidelberg for supporting this project, and especially our co-editor, my co-editor, Elizabeth Becker, who's been very appreciated, has been very much appreciated as our colleague, and sadly not here today with us, but she will no doubt appear in other events around this issue very soon. So let me conclude here. I would like to hand over to Dina Magazzini on this issue of the legal categorizations, but not until I've given the word back to Lior. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marietta. So please let me introduce Tina Magazzini, who is a senior researcher at the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. So Tina's contribution to the special issue is entitled "When Ethnicity is National, Mapping Ethnic Minorities in Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities." And I thought this was a fascinating article, really talking about how ethnicity is used as a proxy for other protected characteristics, and giving really a lot of contextual information from different national contexts. Let me pass it on to Marietta, because I know Marietta had a question she wanted to raise to Tina, and then I'll pass it on to Tina to see what she has to answer.
Well, as I already briefly mentioned, Tina has written very nicely about the mappings, the legal categories around ethnicity. And I wonder, Tina, if you could tell us a little more about the findings of your paper, and especially sort of the similarities and dissimilarities that you've come across.
Sure, absolutely. Firstly, thanks so much, Marietta, but also Leo, Jonathan, for this launch, but also really for kind of like shepherding this special issue from inception to publication. It's been a really rich journey of exchange, and I mean, I love being the person who's asked this question about the legal categorization. I should, as a disclaimer, say that I'm not a lawyer by training. I have a PhD in human rights, but I'm more from comparative political science. And I think one of the beauties of this exchange and of this special issue is the kind of interdisciplinarity of very different approaches that come together to look at this issue. Where my contribution comes in, and where my interest lays, is to try and understand how the laws around ethnicity and minority rights come in, who develops them, how they're justified, and how we can understand them in their also implementation beyond the abstract level. So what just a few points of introduction before going to my argument and the findings is that while I'm not a lawyer, from my perspective, the departing point is, on the one hand, that law tends to be reactive. So it emerges as a consequence of events. And it is generally designed to address as many situations as possible in a homogeneous manner. Now, what this means is that this homogeneous manner that is put in place is typically tailored to the majorities that develop it, and majorities that are typically defined in national terms. I'm now not taking a historical perspective. I'm thinking of contemporary law and minority rights law, as it has been in place and developing over more or less the last century. And so if we acknowledge that the law per se is never neutral, but is the reflection of a status quo that privileges a particular positionality, then it makes sense to look at what kind of remedial tools exist, what frameworks, what laws, what has been developed that specifically tackles minorities. And the way that I have been doing it in this article is to look at the Framework Convention for the Protection and Promotion of National Minorities. The reason being that despite some of its shortcomings, it is still the better known, the broader legally binding framework that we have in Europe for this scope. And so in looking at the Framework Convention, which I focus particularly on comparing kind of how minorities that are defined as national in different countries are understood and are then framed legally. And some of this interest emerged from my kind of trajectory scholarly that has been following for now quite some years, the debate around Romani studies. And the Roma are very often presented in Europe as the largest ethnic minority, but very rarely is it connected to any other kind of ethnic minority. At times very loosely the Jews when we talk about the Holocaust, but otherwise it's very unclear legally what do we talk about when we speak about an ethnic minority in any kind of context, national or European, and what would be the second largest European minority, for example, or the third one. And so in kind of like combing through the reports, the national reports to the Framework Convention that it was developed during the 90s and started being effective in 1998. This kind of like allows us to get a sense of how countries understand not only their minorities, but also their majorities, what their constituency is. And in doing so, what kind of salient categories exist out there. And what comes out is that they're not the same for different countries, which, I mean, it's probably a banality, but I think it's interesting to see how they are differently defined in different countries. So on the one hand, the connection between kind of why I was interested in looking at ethnicity in this context is that in the early 90s, the kind of the whole infrastructure of legislation around minority protection rights stems from a concern with ethnic cleansing and with discrimination against minorities that are defined largely in ethnic terms. So, for example, in 1992, the United Nations General Assembly adopts the Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, or Linguistic Minorities. And in the European context in particular, all the institutions and states, with the exception of the UK, we see this reflected in the framework, shy away from talking about race or racialized minorities. Here, there is an obvious legacy of the Second World War and why this is the case, but it does have consequence because then ethnicity becomes kind of like the proxy for a number of other categorizations as well. And because the Framework Convention also comes in the early 2000s, sort of a de facto necessity for accessing becoming a EU member, what we see is that the early members of the European Union, so the 6 originally member states, out of the 6, we see that 3 actually never managed to ratify this convention. And here we're speaking about France, about the Luxembourg, and about the Belgium, for different reasons that are usually political. But it is a stark contrast with, if we look at the countries of recent accession, particularly since 2004, 2007, in Central and Eastern Europe, all of which have developed quite comprehensive, sophisticated definitions of their national minorities generally declined in ethnic terms. Now, apart from this kind of geographical and also timeline divide, where we see that there is a much stronger emphasis put on minority rights in general and on ethnic minorities from the 90s over the last 2 decades, quarter of a century. What also emerges is that there are kind of 2 categories in particular. One is the Roma and the other is the Jewish population that is recognized as a minority in the majority of states in Europe. Generally as an ethnic category, even though they sometimes fall in the linguistic one or in the religious one for the Jewish community. And here, these are basically the only 2 categories that don't have a automatic state of reference. Because one could think of Israel for the Jewish community, but very often it's not necessarily the case. So it's on the one hand, it's kind of ironic to see how this minority rights as a core value of the European Union has been pushed, promoted by the old core of the founders of the EU. On the other hand, we see that the actual implementation, the adoption and recognition of a number of national minorities is actually quite stronger in Central and Eastern Europe, and in particular, but here we would open a debate also maybe connected to the new ethnicities to some extent, that the one and only country that so far has recognized a national minority that is a migrant minority is the Czech Republic, which recognizes the Vietnamese as one of its national minorities. So I think this is far from being kind of like a conclusive argument. It's been kind of an experiment of trying to map and compare and see what patterns emerge and kind of link it and put it into dialogue with a number of the conversations that are going on in the special issue. So I think I will leave it at that for now and then continue the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina. So there's a lot there and obviously a very rich paper. One thing I would like to pick up on and maybe open it up to some of the other contributors. You mentioned how the idea, the concept of ethnicity might open up new ways to understand not just minorities, but also majorities understood in national terms in European states and beyond. So I wanted to open it up to 2 of the other contributors in conversation, Sophie Lauwers and Vera Messing. Sophie is a political philosopher at KU Leuven, and she is the author of Who Belongs to the Historic Nation, Fictive Ethnicity, and Illiberal Uses of Religious Heritage. Vera Messing is a sociologist based at the Hungarian Institute of Sociology, Center for Social Sciences in Budapest, and also the Democracy Institute in the Central European University. And she's the author with Anders Papp of the article Cacophony in Conceptualizing and Operationalizing Ethnicity, the Case of Roma in Hungary. So obviously you're addressing this kind of question from different perspectives, but I wanted to ask how, in your contributions, you think about the place of ethnic minorities and how they relate to national majorities or the idea of the nation in general. So either on a conceptual level or maybe from the particular Hungarian case that you explored in your article. Sophie, maybe you can start.
Sure, yes. Thank you to the organizers of the special issue and also of this event. I think that questions of nationhood are very important when we talk about ethnicity, especially when it comes to which groups are being excluded from a national community, either because they're not allowed to reside in a certain state or because they have formal citizenship, but they're not considered to fully belong in a certain nation. So in the article in my article in the special issue, I use the work of Etienne Balibar, which I think is very interesting in this context, because he emphasizes that since the very start of sort of nation state formation in Europe, the logic of nationalism really relies on the construction of a people that is assumed to be pre-political, a sort of naturally existing community that has shared origins and shared culture and shared interests, and that is assumed to be sort of always having existed and should also be conserved into the future. So this is what Balibar calls a fictive ethnicity at the heart of basically all forms of nationalism. And he calls it fictive because, of course, there has been much more change and there has been continuity in what we today call national cultures. But this idea of protecting a single historic nation is very powerful, and it still also informs, I think, how we think about cohesion and how we think about diversity as a possible threat to national unity. And this is also why Balibar emphasizes that this logic of fictive ethnicity that he describes at the level of nationalism is very much intertwined with different forms of structural exclusion, including also with the logic of racialization and racism as well. Now, in my contribution to the special issue, I look at how we see this dynamic that Balibar describes in a place where we might not necessarily expect to see it, which is in debates about national religious heritage in Western Europe primarily. And I think that this logic of fictive ethnicity and its exclusionary consequences is particularly clear in claims made by political leaders from the far right, where they call for the protection of a sort of secular Christian and sometimes also white national identity, and where they construe primarily Islam as a threat to that identity, which of course also resembles earlier discourses about Judaism as an outsider to European national cultures. So I think this logic of fictive ethnicity that Balibar describes is very visible. But what I found perhaps at least as interesting, or perhaps even more interesting, is that this logic of there simply existing one historic nation in, for example, France or the Netherlands or Switzerland and so on, is actually also very prominent in mainstream debates about religious heritage. For example, when it comes to discussing planning regulations or subsidies or national holidays or religion in the public sphere and so on. So in these discussions, there is also a kind of assumption that there is a singular secular Christian heritage in European nations, which then I think also underplays both the tension between the secular and the Christian, which of course has had many changes and tensions between them, but also the long-standing presence of religious minorities in Europe. And by this, of course, I don't want to say that I think liberal and illiberal discourses on national religious heritage are the same. I really think they're not. But I do think that this kind of uncritical use of national cultures as if they are self-evident and homogeneous, that kind of reinforces the same, or at least a very similar exclusionary logic. So that's very much from my paper, but maybe I should give the word to Vera, because of course in my work I've really emphasized this connection between ethnicity, race, nation, and religion. But I think, Vera, in your article in the special issue, you write about a minority where the dynamics are in some ways similar, in other ways also different, maybe the case of Roma in Hungary. So maybe you could say something about the position of Roma in sort of nation building in Central Europe and how Roma find themselves being excluded in various ways because of that. You're muted, Vera.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Yes, our paper discusses the case of the Roma in Central East Europe, more specifically in Hungary, a region where Balibar's concept of ethnicity is similarly relevant, or differently, but similar relevant. The Roma have been living in Hungary for centuries. They speak the language of the majority. Their dominant language is Hungarian. They belong to the dominant religious group, which is Christianity. Still, when politicians or even ordinary people speak about the historic nation, Roma are not included most of the time. Their history, culture is regarded as different, and their othering and consequent discrimination in all fields of life is very explicit. And this has been discussed widely by the academic literature so far. There is an effort on the EU and even on national level to address these processes of exclusion and discrimination. Still, most of these efforts fail. So our paper addresses a very important element of this failure, namely the confusions and overlaps in conceptualization of the Roma as an ethnic group, as a racialized minority, as a national minority, in the law, in politics, in public policy, also in statistics and social sciences in Hungary. So our thesis is that conceptualizations and consequent operationalizations and policy framing are connected, and that the incoherent conceptualization of race, ethnicity contribute to the ineffectiveness of policies geared towards ethnic groups in Hungary and probably also in broader Central East Europe. And this is especially true when we think about the Roma population. This seems to be a very theoretical paper, but we bring in the most significant fields where this kind of confusion in conceptualization of race, ethnicity, and nationality result in a failure of addressing discrimination and social exclusion. Namely, we bring in the field cases from political representation, education, and the labor market. So let me give an example to bring it closer to practices. Let me bring in the example of education. So educational policies, as well as actors in education, like principals, teachers, support staff in schools, struggle with simultaneously addressing minority cultural needs, the social disadvantaged position of children of Roma background, and meeting the special educational needs of students that often stem from experiences of discrimination and social deprivation. The performance gap between Roma and non-Roma students has been discussed widely by my colleagues and others, and it has multiple complex and intersecting causes, including ethno-racial discrimination, the ethnic gap in social position, and the lack of recognition of Roma culture. So, but depending on the identification of the core of the cause of educational disadvantages, policymakers would need to address Roma students as members of a racialized group suffering discrimination, or as member of an ethnic community with a need to maintain cultural heritage, or as socially disadvantaged students, or even as children with special educational needs. However, and these of course overlap and make a confusion in reality. So in reality, a cacophony of approaches and practices are at work, some addressing social disadvantages, others recognizing cultural minority rights, while imprecise or incomplete conceptualization becomes grounds for ill-designed measures. So what we do is to bring together the perspective. In our paper, we bring together the perspective of social sciences and the law, and argue that the consistency of these conceptualizations of actually who or what the Roma are is crucial in terms of how policies for Roma are designed. So maybe that's it, and maybe we can continue our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Vera and Sophie. So perhaps this is a good place for us to follow up from these issues of conceptualization to ask more practically and perhaps normatively, first, why, maybe generalizing from the Roma case to other ethnic minorities in Europe, such as Muslims and Jews, why do they fall through the cracks of the legal framework, I think, as Tina mentioned in her brief contribution earlier? And then maybe briefly, what changes in the law or in public policy could there be to address these failures? And I know Vera and Andras, you addressed this question in your paper. So maybe Andras, maybe you can say a couple of words about what possible solutions could be to this problem. So I haven't introduced you yet. Andras Pap is a professor in constitutional and administrative law at the Center of Social Sciences at Budapest, and also a professor of law at the Faculty of Economics at Ethnicity University. So Andras, please, in a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on to Tina and Marietta for their possible answers on this question.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for the incredibly volatile connection I have, but I hope you can hear me. So my starting point as a lawyer is a paradoxical situation in two senses. One is that lawyers are always capable of executing all types of political demands for categorization. This is what lawyers do. And of course, law is one of the endpoints of all, philosophical, political, policy discussions. So it should seem like an easy case to be, but what we actually see is that the legal codification, as well as the practical usage of these concepts, is extremely chaotic. Which is not only an academic issue, because this is exactly what the case study of the Roma shows, that when there is the conceptualization is problematic, that's, by the way, usually due to the lack of a coherent political policy or policy standpoint on what these communities should be like. What are we, when we talk about Roma, what are they? Is it a race? Is this a racialized, a race group? Is it ethnicity? Is it a national minority? Is it class? What are we talking about? When we talk about the Jews, what are the Jews? Is it religion? Is it an ethnicity? Or obviously it's both. Well, we actually see that even in one legal system, we see several clusters or several conceptualizations for one group. And why is this a problem? But because, as we see, let me just give you the example of which sort of we mentioned in a footnote, is the Article 1 of the 1965 International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So, right, it says the term racial discrimination shall mean any distinction, exclusion, restriction, preference based on race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin. Well, that's not really helpful when we're actually trying to make something out of this concept. So why is this a problem? The problem is that when we have mismatching conceptualizations, it hijacks political discourses, and it also opens up the case for fraud. It opens up the case, or actually makes the policy measures ineffective. So what we're trying to do, I'm trying to do as a lawyer, and also what we're trying to do in this paper, is to try to match conceptualization with policies, right? So when we talk about national minorities, what we're interested in is culture, claims, language, etc. When we talk about race, we talk about protection from discrimination, hate crime, hate speech, etc. Ethnicity is a little bit more complicated in this because it seems to be sort of a hybrid category. So this is the one thing that we're trying to look at. The other that we're trying to look at is how law operationalizes these concepts. And we see that there are 5 ways through which law can actually work. Is self-identification, so subjective methods, objective ones, DNA, descent, something like that. We can ask the community. So there are 5 different ways. And basically the argument we're making in this paper and pointing to is that, well, there should be some sort of a consistency to the concepts, the policies, and the operational mechanisms. And if we don't do that, then we're actually in trouble. So basically, this is how we can sum up, I guess, the argument of what I'm and what we're trying to make in point of this. And also the other very practical argument that we're making here, and this is it's very practical. It has very practical consequences, which is what we call the Murphy law of prejudice, and sort of this misunderstood data protection or privacy approach that we see in Europe, which basically, of course, does not prevent perpetrators of identifying their victims. If someone wants to commit an anti-Semitic incident, whether verbal or physical, that person will probably not have a problem identifying who the Jews are, or probably won't care if if it's not a perfect conceptualization. But on the other hand, when, for example, employers, as Vera's research shows, for example, when employers are trying to be in good faith, trying to be, helpful in terms of social integration, then they're all of a sudden faced with this incredible, again, which we argue legally unfounded dilemma of, well, we can't actually say what ethnicity is. We can't actually say who the Roma are. So this is some of the issues I thought were sort of relevant in our inquiry.
Great, thank you, Anders. I'll just, before moving on to the next contributors, I just want to point out to those of you who are watching us online, if you want to raise any questions for our panelists, this is the time. So Tina, just back to you, if you can quickly respond to what I know you mentioned you're not a lawyer by training, but what do you think would be the steps to be made in terms of law or policy that might address these kind of challenges and gaps of the one that Anders and Leah were suggesting in their paper?
So yes, kind of like to build up to what Andres was saying, since the issue was kind of like how do certain minorities fall through the cracks? How are they not supported or captured by these protection? I think because one of the points that I had raised earlier is that sometimes the justification for excluding these minorities is led to rootedness or to a specific territory of belonging. I think not for all cases, but in certain cases, national territorial autonomy has been, non-territorial autonomy has been ignored as an option. So kind of like rights that are not specifically tied to proving that they have been rooted for centuries. But also, I think that looking at times beyond the European experience and seeing how in legal and policy terms things are done elsewhere could be helpful, not necessarily to import critically other models, but I'm thinking, for example, for the background noise, that in the case of Roma, in Brazil, they have been recently recognized as an indigenous community, which gives them certain kind of rights. Now, this might work for some groups better than others, but I think that one broader kind of like generalization that we can make is that when we already have some legal and policy provision in place for specific minorities, in doubt to make it inclusive. So one point that I kind of open up in my article is what will the Roma Convention do in the European case in the future to deal with migrant minorities? If we think, for example, of the fact that Poland already recognizes historical Ukrainians that have resided for centuries in Poland as a national minorities, what will it do with Ukrainian refugees that have arrived over the past years? I would suggest that in doubt, being inclusive about how recognition policies are interpreted would be one way to go forward. And then finally, maybe just one point that is often raised in relationship to the Romani minority, but I think goes beyond it, is that there's often a debate between do we need more recognition or more redistribution? What kind of rights should we afford minorities? If we kind of recognize a certain body as having some kind of representation, does this come at the expense of kind of broader economic redistribution? And I think this is a complete false dichotomy, and that we need more than both. So kind of to pitch minorities against each other is also one of the potential pitfalls of policies that should be carefully considered and avoided.
Great. Thank you very much, Tina. So we got a question from the audience watching at home, I guess, that maybe I'll raise to the group in general, and we can see if we can reach an interesting answer to. So the question is, in the context of European states, how can an identity consensus be reached between self-identity, ethnic identity, and religious identity? In other words, how can the conflicts and tensions between these identities be resolved by forming some kind of identity consensus within the plurality of identities? So I'm not going to cold call you. I see Anders is very eager to answer this question. So Anders, maybe quickly, if you can try and answer.
Yes, it's rude to correct the question, but I think I would like to clarify. So I think the question is, so there are two different things: self-identity and the other type of conceptualization. So I don't, the question is, I don't think there can be even theoretically a consensus in terms of whether a community is racial, religious, whatnot. And I think there's no problem with having an overlapping conceptualization. Okay, so you can say that yes, Jews are religious. They are worthy of the protection of religious identity, and also can be protected from racist, hate crime. So there's no problem with that. There's also not a particularly strong, I don't have a particular problem with conceptualizing the Roma as a national minority as well as an ethnic minority, as long as we're straightforward saying that when we talk about race, when we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about protections from victimization. When we talk about national minorities, we're talking about nation building, culture issues, whatnot, and that's for the political community whether they want to recognize, these groups as such. Indigeneity is another very interesting question, and the reason why I, sort of was so aggressive in wanting to answer this, because I'm very passionate about this. The other issue you raised is whether we're talking about self-identification or endorse, or do we require an endorsement from the community, whatnot. And sort of this is where the two questions are actually connected, because if you have community representatives saying that, well, we actually want to be recognized as a national minority. For example, in the case of the Jews, in Hungary, they were offered to be included in the Act on National Minorities in the early 1990s, and they said, thank you, no thank you. Later on, some members who claim to be representatives of the community said, we would actually like that. That initiative was unsuccessful because they couldn't get enough political support for that. So the only thing we're trying, or at least I'm trying to make here, is try to sort of clear up the concept and at least distinguish between operational strategies and conceptualization issues. Sorry if I was too long.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much, Anders. Marietta, so maybe we can link this question from the online audience to the question we raised earlier, right? On why do we think these kind of identities fall through the cracks, and what kind of response might we have practically, normatively? And I know in your paper you had a somewhat different suggestion or related suggestion to that.
Yes, thank you for raising this question, Lior, from the Q&A. I think I agree with Andras that at some level it's difficult to reconcile what might the identity that one might identify with and the identity that maybe society or maybe the law ascribes to certain people or to certain groups. I think one of the suggestions I've come up with in my paper is to explicitly recognize this dynamic of self-identification and ascription of identity through the language of positionality. So, for example, when there is a claim of discrimination and the question is, was somebody discriminated on the basis of religion, race, or maybe something different, maybe it's really important to acknowledge that the act of discrimination also comes with an act of ascription, rather than sort of the assumption that because somebody was assumed to be Muslim or somebody was assumed to be Jewish, that therefore they actually are. That may or may not be the case. I think the other solution that I articulated in my paper, aside from including ethnicity as its own category in the law, whether that is for the purposes of criminal law or for the purposes of anti-discrimination law, is to talk about liminality as a way to say certain practices or certain identities cannot even be exclusively sort of named as religious or ethnic or racial, but are more ambiguous. They're somewhere in between. Maybe even for the people involved, it's not so clear sort of what label would be most appropriate, because there are several labels that at the same time could be appropriate or could be partially appropriate, or could be appropriate for some in the minority group, but not for others. So to acknowledge that ambiguity through the language of liminality is the second solution that I've added in. And in a way, to talk about both positionality and liminality can do justice to this distance between self-identification and the ascription of certain identity by third parties, for example. But it doesn't necessarily have to rely on the inclusion of ethnicity, insofar as this liminality can also be recognized between the categories that are already existing in the law, whether it's language, whether it's race, whether it's religion, whether it's gender. However, I think it would be healthy to talk about ethnicity as an independent characteristic, even independent from issues like ethnic origin, which presume that there has been some movement from country A to country B at some point, even if it was 2 or 3 generations before. And at some point, we need to acknowledge that certain identities, ethnic identities, are rooted identities in the states that we are talking about. 3rd, 4th, and 5th, at some point, generation migrants may have very little personal experience of that migration and may not regard themselves as migrants, and in fact may not be migrants because they never did this. So I think this is quite helpful to bridge this gap between self-identification and ascription. Thank you.
Thank you. So we only have a couple more minutes left, and I wanted to, in that brief time, raise a question to Sophie with regards to these themes that we just discussed. So towards the end of your paper, Sophie, you discussed what this might mean for normative theories of nationalism, and specifically so-called liberal nationalism, and how we might change these philosophical theories in light of the issue of ethnicity. Maybe, I know we don't have a lot of time, but maybe you can say something about that?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And I think it also connects to the question in the chat, so that's nice. So I think in relation to the question, and already the answers of the other contributors chimes in with that maybe the idea of looking for an identity consensus on the level of the state was never perhaps a good idea, and most certainly is not a good idea right now, right? In the context in which we value difference and sort of people having different ethnic, cultural, racial, and other gender, class affiliations. But I think it is really important to have a debate about what kind of political community then you are looking to have, because I do think it's important to say that you cannot have a political community without culture, and I don't think we should want it, even if it was possible. So then the challenge becomes for I think all of us, and also for normative political theory, to come up with certain guidelines to have a process to come to a sort of democratic debate about the kind of identity that we would want as a political community. Now, in liberal theory, that has often been based on sort of negative restrictions of certain types of identity should not be endorsed on the level of the state. For example, we don't want a national racial identity. We also don't want a national identity that imposes on people what kind of religion they should or should not have. And I think those are both really important restrictions. But what I would suggest, perhaps as a sort of final thought, also to leave us with, is perhaps there also are positive responsibilities by the state to allow different voices to participate in the democratic dialogue on an equal footing, which means we have to look a little bit more closely at the quality of democratic debate. And also the categories that we use to think, also in terms of who can be recognized, who wants to be recognized, on what model and what mold can certain groups claim recognition, and to, as it were, have a more sort of pluralizing debate in which we allow minorities themselves to speak more in these discussions, which currently have been very top-down, and also in political theory have usually had a top-down tendency. So in answer to your question, Lior, I don't think I, as a political theorist, have an answer for what kind of model we should seek to model our political communities on. But I do think as scholars working on these topics, we can pinpoint some of the risks in how to have that discussion and some of the importances of creating space for voices that have been historically and also in the contemporary context often been excluded. I hope that's an answer to your question.
That's a great answer. Thank you much, Sophie. So unfortunately, this is the end of our time today. I think we got a great sneak peek to what a fruitful conversation between law, sociology, political science, and philosophy can bring to the table on these kind of issues. So I highly recommend anyone to go and read the special issue. And Marietta, would you like to have the final word as the co-editor of the special issue?
Sure. Let me use this final word to really thank everyone who has been a part of this. It's been such a privilege to work with a group of scholars over a longer period of time, not just to produce this next publication as we're all pressed to do, but really to develop a conversation amongst ourselves as scholars that will continue beyond this particular special issue. And also for the friendships that form through that sort of longer term engagement with each other's work. So I really want to thank all the contributors for being part of that journey, being part of that conversation. And again, I would like to thank Lior and Jonathan for kindly hosting us today. With that, I guess I would like to wish everyone a good rest of their day. Please go and read the special issue, as has been mentioned several times. Some of the articles are open access, not all, but quite a number of them are. And enjoy reading what we've been trying to put to paper. Thank you.